A warm Doha greeting to you. My name is Mehran Kamrava. I am director of the Iranian Studies Unit at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, and also professor of government at Georgetown University in Qatar. We have tonight with us one of the most distinguished authorities on Iranian clerical establishment and social media, Professor Babak Rahimi, who is professor of communication and religion and culture at the University of California in San Diego. Professor Rahimi is one of the most distinguished scholars of the field and a very prolific author. If I were to outline his numerous publications, we would be here all night. But I just want to give a very brief introduction concerning the nature of the talk. Of course, we know that the clerical establishment and Shia authority is in power in Iran, and we are indeed in the age of social media and digital media. Professor Rahimi will be discussing Shia Iranian clerical authority at play in the age of digital media. Without further ado, Professor Rahimi, over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kamrava. I want to thank you for inviting me, for giving such a generous and welcoming introduction. I do not deserve it, but I'm very grateful. Thank you so much. I know time is limited, so I prefer to start immediately, if you don't mind. I should also greet you from cloudy San Diego, California, where every day is not sunny. Today is very cloudy and rainy. And that definitely puts me in the mood to give a very humorous, hopefully, talk to everyone about Iranian Shia clerics at play. Now, let me start the PowerPoint presentation. Okay, are you able to see the pictures? Everything's okay?
Yes, it's great.
Okay, perfect. So let me start. Scrolling down your Instagram feed, you may come across what some in the US media are calling Iran's counterpart to retweet of Instagram. So I'm trying to go forward. Here we go. So shut down in 2014, the account has become an appealing site to journalists and policymakers, especially in the US, where the future of Iran promises to be a secular, westernized, quotation mark society, devoid, of course, of theocracy or much of clerical authority in power. Now, there are numerous examples that this narrative. Here's a case of the Instagram of Babak Rahimi, the famous model. This person is not related to me. I have applied for modeling agency. I was rejected, but this guy was accepted. So he's a very popular figure. He's around 88,000 followers.
لديه حوالي 88 ألف متابع، وأيضا هناك حسابات متعددة على انستغرام. هذا الحساب
celebrities are famous people, and this is just the one I was able to find, but there's so many of them. Iranian Instagram is somewhat revolves around for last year or two around famous stars, soccer stars, movie stars, and they have exploded. Then there's this one weird one that just came out a few months ago, Sohail Sangarzadeh. He is probably one of the most famous of all influencers. He's famous as a person who is a bodybuilder, a kind of a spiritual guru, and is also an interesting mix of a luti a pir, a Sufi pir, and an Arnold Schwarzenegger all combined together. I mean, he has around, well, actually more than 2 million followers. Then there is, of course, a market out there, e-commerce, in which Iranian Instagrammers are putting up businesses, they're selling stuff, they're buying stuff, and it's a very vibrant market. However, if you like to waste away a bit of your time in the endless forest of ads, selfies, and ephemeral hashtags, including videos, revolving around the myth of digital individualism, that you may perhaps accidentally come across an Instagram account of a Shia cleric. Now, this is one interesting and fascinating Instagram account of the seminary students, the Tullab. And as you could see here, the website is very vibrant. It wants to show how the Tullab live in their everyday life. I encourage you to follow this particular site because this is where you find many instances of seminarians engaging with in their everyday life. You might also come across an Instagram account of this particular mid-ranking cleric who likes to play pool, and he likes to put it on Instagram. There's another one where this mid-rank cleric is taking out money from ATM. The same cleric is sitting with his family, with his children and his family, and they're just, having a post for Instagram for others to see. If you notice, this particular pic got around 17,000 likes. That's incredible. The most likes I've ever received on Instagram is 107. So you might wonder what's going on here. What's going on here is that there is an interesting social or cultural capital, however you want to define it, social capital behind these patterns that we find in these various Instagram profiles. This is another one. Mustafa Rahimi has no relations with me. He's pretty active, and I'm going to come back and talk about him later on in this presentation. And in this presentation, you notice that he is with his family. He is covering the face of his wife with a flower. And yes, yet while having a domestic sphere, he's able to make it public and have this Instagram pic for a number of people to see. Almost 5,000 people like this particular pic. There's another case of another mid-ranking cleric who is not wearing his turban, who is in his everyday situation and picnicking with his family somewhere in the countryside. And he gets comments, people saying, wonderful, this is great. Or in this actually case, I think, they are celebrating or remembering someone's death. So people are responding and are feeling empathy for his loss. There's another case of a cleric boxer who regularly comes on Instagram, shows his boxing skills. He also does traditional sports of Zurkhane, and he very much embodies the masculine ideal of Javan Mardi on his Instagram account. And this person almost has 10,000 likes for this particular pic. Sorry, let me go back. And I've been trying to find Mohammad Hossein Safari's Instagram account, the famous cleric karate guy. I haven't been able to find it, but in case you do, please let me know. These are just examples of numerous of clerics who are on Instagram. Instagram has become, for sure, the most famous social media site for clerics to participate. And they do their participation in different ways. Now, what is happening? And this is really the basic argument that I like to lay out here, not to go into theory, but what I do want to argue is that these clerics are innovatively reconstructing authority through new practices of being clerics in public life. And of course, by highlighting their private domains in public life, they're introducing new practices of being clerics, of being cool Muslims, in a globalizing world. Now, the idea of new here should be flagged. We are talking about complicated and performative ways in which identity is being negotiated, the identity of clerical authority is being negotiated and undergoes change through, now here's the key word, acceleration of life in late capitalism. I don't have time to go in depth what I mean here. Hopefully in the Q&A I could expand this. But what I do say is that somehow with social media, and not just with social media, just everything, all infrastructures of everyday life, human experience has become increasingly accelerated. And this is not just in terms of time, but also space as well. The way things have shrunk, of course, time and space configuration has made us into species of speed. Acceleration here, I'm specifically talking about increasing high speed experiences in various spheres of life, economy, culture, politics. And of course, we should not forget about religion. Religion is also undergoing an acceleration of time and space. Now, Instagram is a great micro example of that acceleration of life, experiencing of a space of life, living in modern life, in a modern condition. What Instagram is providing is a kind of a visual cultural space of temporal acceleration for representation of authority, in this particular case, clerical authority, in performances of correct conduct, such as piety, hospitality, and also fun. Let's not forget that Islamic tradition or traditions also includes a history or a tradition of doing fun things. The Prophet is known to celebrate swimming, horseback riding, hunting, and these are the kind of physical activities that in Islamic tradition are regarded to be quote unquote fun. Now, of course, now in the early 21st century, we have a reconstruction of that concept of fun, and Instagram can be understood as that similar practice that they did back in, say, 7th century, when now Instagram is that, horse riding, or swimming practice. Of course, people still swim, but now Instagram is a kind of updated version of the things that people did in the past, one could argue. My argument, though, is that this aspect of clerical presence on Instagram should not be seen as their authority being diminished. In fact, the reverse is enhancing their clerical authority, and is enhancing it by emphasizing one of the most important aspects of authority in general. Now, Max Weber is famous for setting up the ideal types of authority: traditional, legal, rational, charismatic. Usually people associate clerical authority with traditional authority, but that's not it. And what I want to do in the next 5 minutes is to outline how Shi'a clerical authority throughout the centuries has actually managed to maintain or somehow combine these three important forms of authority into its establishment, its organization. Now, one could add here an important aspect of authority, the technical or the technicity aspect. In order to have authority, one should have certain skills. And these skills are not just about skills of, just knowing something, but how you could interpret and apply the thing that you know into a technical practice. This is what traditional authority is so good at. It actually manages to maintain itself as static while being dynamic. This is the paradox of traditional authority. And at the heart of it is this technical dimension, the skill to maintain the aura of being permanent, of stable, while at the same time being very dynamic in terms of interpretation, applying your authority in everyday life. One could apply the same to legal, rational, and charismatic authority, except that in the case of charismatic, usually it goes away after a particular charismatic leader dies. And there's a famous case of routinization of charisma, which in the case of Islamic Republic, for instance, we see after the death of Ayatollah Khomeini, the Islamic State has tried its best to routinize that charisma. And it's been really 30 years or so history of managing that routinization. Now, time is short and I'm already running out of so much time. So I want to just make clear that I'm here focusing on clerics. They're all men. I'm not looking at female religious authorities, so that in itself is extremely important field of research. I'm looking at mostly mid-ranking clerics. I'm looking at, obviously, post-revolution Iran. We didn't have Instagram prior to even earlier periods of the Iranian Revolution. I'm also looking at Qom-based clerics mostly. When I speak of Shia Islam, I'm specifically thinking of Ithna Ashari and Imami Shiism. I am looking at Instagram, so I am kind of skipping and not looking at Twitter and Facebook. Those also have a life of their own. I'm also going to skip over a lot of theoretical stuff, which is in a paper that ultimately this presentation is based on. Now, let's look at history and how these three levels of authority have come to play in the formation of the clerical establishment. Unlike, or in contrast to common belief that Shiism emerged right immediately after the succession or after the death of the Prophet, what we do know is that the earliest evidence we have of a Shia community emerge around rituals, prayers, and pilgrimage, sometime in the 8th century. That is to say, for nearly 200 years, we don't have hardcore evidence to say what really Shia identity was like in those formative years, in particularly during the early Umayyad period, and of course the Caliphate period prior to the Umayyad. What we do know is that by late Umayyad, with the leadership of Ja'far ibn Sadiq, we really have the beginnings of a religious minority community that is built around new doctrines, the doctrine of imamat. Now, before that, we do have a kind of a ritual community, and Najm Haidar has written a wonderful book on this. But by really late Umayyad period, we really begin to see the beginnings of the Shia community. Why is that important? Because it is around, well, actually after this time when the doctrine of occultation comes to existence. This is the doctrine that the 12th Imam, male descendants of Prophet, has gone into hiding, into a minor, and then a greater one in which we are now living. And during this time, really it is rational thinking. This is the great and interesting, distinct feature of Shia jurisprudence, thanks to mostly Sheikh Tusi, that allows the cleric to be the representative of the Mahdi prior to his reappearance. Now, in this era, what the clerics now as the new representative for the Shia community are responsible for, the authority is that traditional authority. So this is it right here. The traditional authority to interpret sources, Quran, Hadith, and other key texts in order to interpret and, more importantly, apply them to everyday life. Applying them to the everyday life really becomes the job and the task and the technicity of jurisprudence, and the clerics managed to maintain that authority for centuries, well, all the way up to the rise of Safavids in 1501. When Shah Ismail declared Ethna Ashari Shiism to be the state religion of Safavid state, or the new Safavid state, he also invited Shia clerics from Lebanon to migrate to the new Shia empire. Now, don't have time to go in depth with this, but what we do know, thanks to Andrew Newman, is that migration was very, very limited, and it was not a massive one. The most important character was Al-Karaki and his interpretation and and role in state and Safavid state became paramount, because eventually in the 17th century, we began really to see the institutionalization of Sheikh al-Islam office. The first time Shiism is moving out from its independent, somehow self-enclosed institution by participating in state craft. I'm moving here really fast, but there's a point I'm trying to make. The division between, or the tension between Akhbari-Usuli, schools of thought in 18th century was very important. Why? Akhbaris believed in the imitation and following the sources without doing so much of rational interpretation. Usulis beg to differ, and they argued that in fact clerics have the authority to interpret, and because they have ijtihad. The door of ijtihad is open to Shiism, in contrast to Sunni Islam, Ahl Sunnat. So therefore, what Usuli triumph did in 18th century is that enhance the power of the clerics in the urban rural spaces. This is also a time when we begin to see clerics not only gaining legal rational authority as they did in the Safavid era, but they maintain a fascinating imbalance and an interplay between the traditional and legal rational authority, with some of them participating in Qajar states, though at the same time trying to keep a distance. In terms of technology, let's not forget that the most famous fatwa by Ayatollah Mirza Hassan al-Shirazi, which challenged or put a stop to the tobacco consumption as a way to challenge the Shah's concession to the British company in 1891, 1892, was sent through telegraph from Najaf to Iran. Now, why do I bring this up? Because by 19th century, the clerics are not only relying on the more older traditional technologies, such as the production of manuscripts written and distributed throughout the so-called Shia world, which goes from Lebanon to Lucknow. But now by 19th century, they're using telegraph to enhance the authority through communication technology. And this is one very famous example of it. In 1939, the combined, most of the traditional authority, but now some of the clerics are also involved in statecraft as well on some level. The clerics are using radio to put up religious programs, and these religious programs are meant to somehow negotiate a way through the Pahlavi modernization throughout the 40s and 50s. During this time, radio is the most important. It's really the Instagram of its time. So, and clerics, not all of them, but some of them are very clever in using them in order to propagate and also advance the religious cause. Electronic Manbar, the famous chapter in Small Media, Big Revolution, I encourage you to read that book that was published in 1994, argues that by 1960s, we have the cassette tapes where a number of clerics, including, of course, Ayatollah Khomeini in 1964, are using it in order to reinterpret a kind of a radical conception of Shia politics, and clerics, of course, are at the center of it. Don't also forget microphones. Microphones and are now a key essential way in which communication is radically changing throughout the 50s all the way to 1970s. You could easily talk about the 1979 revolution as a telecommunication revolution as well, the way cassette tapes were used in order to really lead the most important mass-based revolution in the modern period. Now, by 1990s, we see the rise of internet. Now, I'm again skipping through so much of history, but I hope you forgive me, and I hope that we could do a good Q&A session after this. What is important about the internet is that it not only introduced a new communication, but it also changed much of state and bureaucratic administrative infrastructure. And that also, one could easily apply that to the banking sector, to economy. And this is not just Iran, this is a global phenomenon. Now, in the case of Iran, unlike the US, Internet did not, it started off through the educational sector. In the US, it was definitely the commercial sector, business sector, and of course, there was a counterculture in California that was very much heavily involved in that. But in the case of Iran, a number of countries, by the way, in the global south, education is really the key institution or sector through which this new technology is now being advanced. And let's not forget the person who's pushing for this. One is an Iranian mathematician who studied in Berkeley. And second is Larijani, who, you know, he was also, I understand, I think I'm correct to say that he was educated in the US, but he's very much tied to the Iranian state. His brother, of course, was the former Speaker of Majlis. So the role of state cannot be ignored here. State was, in the beginning, was very much pushing for the growth of internet, mostly in understanding that, first of all, it's good for economy, and second of all, it's a kind of a scientific tool in which the Islamic Republic needs to advance itself. What's interesting, though, is that once internet achieved that high level of educational activity within various universities across Iran, from Tehran to Mazandaran province, beginning from those two provinces, it began to become a political site. It began to be used by a number of activists to do many different kind of political activities. E-journalism, by the way, was key in the beginning stages of internet growth in Iran. Now, we also know that sometime in late 1990s, early 2000s, there was a growth of new public spaces in which revolve around internet. These are cyber cafes and, you know, different new computer centers. Now people are going. I remember back in early 2000s, I used to do my email by going to one of these computer centers and, you know, just use the computers there. And these are places of conviviality. These are third spaces where people will come, congregate, and very much similar to parks. They would talk and discuss things. Same thing now is also happening in Qom, in the Hawza or the seminary in Qom, and Isfahan and Mashhad, but I'm going to focus here on Qom. What's happening is that, first and foremost, computers are increasingly being incorporated within the Hawza system. Clerics, seminarians, Tullab, and Hujjat al-Islams, the mid-ranking clerics, are heavily using now these new technologies. And these technologies, at first, from 1990s to early 2000s, are being used to advance the views of a particular high-ranking cleric, a marja taqlid. And these activities really revolve around question and answer and some kind of a participation by the followers of a marja asking question from the source of imitation. Now, amid all of that, there's politics. The famous example is Ayatollah Montazeri, who posted his memoir online. He wasn't able to publish it, so he posted online in December 2000, and that created a lot of discussion in the Iranian political sphere. The state realized there's something going on. We should put it, you know, we should curtail the internet and the way people are using websites and blogs. But anyway, the change was already underway, and there was no way of reversing it. And this was very clear in the case of Hawza, especially, which was not involved in the domestic Iranian politics extensively, like the way Tehran was, for instance, or Isfahan or Tabriz or Mashhad, with the young people going on blog and doing different kind of political activities. But in Qom, what we see is really the prominence of Ayatollah Sistani, who not only establishes the first clerical site from Qom, but he also established a physical space where now where internet, and of course his site is the main domain, but he's also giving host to other websites as the main domain for other clerics to come and actually, you know, use the domain in order to have their own websites. Now, this is a picture I took back in, if I'm correct, this is 2005, and I was interested to visit this site because just a month before I had a meeting with Ayatollah Sistani, and I wanted to see what he has done in Qom. And of course, it's not him, it was his son-in-law who was leading this charge. the مرکز جهانی اطلاعات رسانی اهل البیت. And this particular center is fascinating. I mean, once you walk in, you know, it tells you that this is really a computer-centric space. These young men who run the website of Ayatollah Sistani, at least back in 2005, they were much younger. They were in their late teens and early 20s. And they're all orphans. They're all actually part of Ayatollah Sistani's organization. They're orphans of Ayatollah Sistani as the wali of these orphans. And they run his computer center. He's the head of Sistani's information center. And there are many activities that the Sistani organization continues to do. One of the most important is, as I mentioned, the followers of Sistani would ask questions and his representatives try to answer. If they can answer, they send the question through email to Najaf, and then Sistani himself answers the question. This one is interesting. It was just accidentally, I took a picture of this. The question is, I could probably say it, it's okay. Can a woman perform oral sex for her husband? And the answer is yes. And these are the kind of questions that Sistani would get. It's just one of them. And people wonder why he has so many followers around the world. Amazes me. But anyway, 2007, we see the Islamic Republic from the office of the Supreme Leader establishing Computer Research Center for Islamic Sciences. This is a place where digital media is being disseminated and reproduced on a daily basis. So things are expanding, and the clerics are very much an active participant in this growing digital sphere. The famous expression Shia blogosphere is known for key clerics like Muhammad Ali Abtahi participating, having, Abtahi had his website, had his blog, and he would do Shia chat. He would engage with his friends, followers, and students online. Of course, he has evolved from the blogosphere into the social media, and I'll have one clip of him or one pic of him later in this presentation. We also have a very interesting new phenomenon with Shia Muslim women, Shia female seminarians who go online and they sort of, as one scholar who put it, they would unveil themselves in cyberspace, and particularly through their blog activities. This is all happening in early 2000s, mid 2000s. The Green Movement in 2009 definitely showed the impact of social media, and I should say at this stage, internet blogging, but also social media is now on its way in mid 2000s. It really underlined how social media is expanding, and it's actually helping many activists to do many of their activities through Facebook. Now, there were limits to these social media activities, and I have written on this. Twitter, for instance, at that time was not popular, but Facebook was. And that came to an end 10 days or few days after the elections. So there were limitations. But what we do get beyond the political sphere is that social media in particular by mid-2000s is becoming massively popular. So it's not just the political activists, but they're also people in business, commerce, but also in religion who are actively present on social media. Facebook, these are pictures that I took from Facebook, the middle one, Instagram, but much of the Facebook activities in mid-2000s by, in particular, clerics revolved around some kind of a ritual ceremony or something in which they would perform mourning and also do other activities, mostly mourning on Facebook. Now, we do know that there was a case of Ayatollah Ali Kazem Burujerdi, a famous dissident cleric who did his talks, his anti-state or dissident discourses on YouTube. We do know that somehow by mid-2000s and later on, some of the clerics or the anti-government clerics are going online, in particular on social media, doing their activities, but it was very limited. I want to clarify this. This is important. By 2012 to 2015, we see the rise of smartphone markets. And the smart cell phone or smartphone really paved the path in further expanding and allowing numerous other clerics to participate in the social media landscape. Now, what is important about the smartphone is that internet is connected to this particular new kind of technology that was introduced to the market in early 2010. And by 2015, we see an explosion of religious mind, in particular clerics, who are now participating on numerous social media. Instagram is particularly a popular site because it was not filtered. It's very visually centric, and there's so much that can be said through pics and videos in which you cannot do in other social media sites. So by 2016-17, Instagram really becomes the most important commercial site, and religious actors are very much involved. They do their own teaching on Instagram. They do their live classes, and they're also increasingly becoming personalized. These are individuated networks in which particular clerics are now, or students, seminarians, they're talking about their personal life. They're putting pictures of their family. This was not the case back in mid-2000s, by the way. By really 2016-17, this is becoming very prominent, very normalized. And we have now this phenomenon, this Instagram cleric phenomenon, in which key clerics are becoming influencers. These clerics, many of them are mid-ranking. In this case, Shahab Moradi, who is probably the most famous cleric influencer. He's famous for a number of reasons. As you could see, he's posting pictures of himself in everyday situations. He loved to take pictures with babies, by the way. In the Corona era, he's wearing his mask, trying to exemplify himself in what is really good behavior for common good. He's very popular, so people like to take selfies with him. He's also on TV, so he does work in the so-called older media, and he kind of combines the two. There's interesting convergence media happening here. Moradi is also very funny. After Soleimani was assassinated by the US, the next day or so, he went on his Instagram and said, wait, who said that we're going to take revenge against the US? It would be kind of difficult because all their heroes are just made up. And he was making reference to SpongeBob and Spider-Man. That element of humor and play is something that you also see clerics do in their Friday khutbah, in the Jum'ah khutbah sermons. And so that shouldn't surprise us. What fascinating is the migration of that humor culture into the Instagram sphere, and how this cleric is bravely actually talking. Of course, in this particular case, it's a bit political, but they do this in different ways, sometimes very everyday, sometimes just very in a very mundane way. What's important about this is that this cleric now is a state actor cleric, but he's also able to express some of his very private emotions. I mean, in this particular case, he's talking about watching Stepmom and crying. I don't know, has anyone watched this film? I'm actually really curious to watch it. Maybe I'll watch it this weekend. But he's actually talking about how he felt really nice watching, very emotional watching this film. This kind of public.
ومثل هذا النوع.
Okay, I think it's 30 minutes. I'm trying to wrap up.
أعتقد أننا وصلنا نهاية 30 دقيقة. سأختم.
The idea of highlighting your private life into the
إن
public,
فكرة
or making
إبراز
public
حياتك
life in a
الشخصية
way
علنا
that is
أو
simply
التصرف
supposed to
في حياتك
exemplify a way
العامة
of being
بطريقة
an ethical
يفترض
cleric is
أنها
great due to all these
تقدم
different
رجل
Instagram
الدين
accounts.
كمثال
There's another
وقدوة.
Instagram
هذا هو
account
المهم. لهذا
of
السبب من بين
Ismaila
حسابات
Amjad, who goes into
الانستغرام
different villages and he takes books and foods and computer to small kids in various impoverished villages and post these pictures on his Instagram. He has a lot of followers, and actually he doesn't have that much followers, but he's very popular in the Hausa for his activities. This is another case, Amir Mahdi Mana Ghabi, who talks about the disappearance of older spaces and the replacement of new urban spaces, and there's a lot of nostalgia in his work. Mustafa Rahimi, the guy I mentioned to you earlier, he's an animal lover. So he posts his pictures on animals, feeding animals, taking care of animals, dogs in particular, which in itself creates an interesting question of jurisprudence. Are you supposed to touch the animal or the dog, or are you not supposed to help the dog? He has an interesting ethics of animal care on his Instagram. And of course, Mr. Abtahi, who famously had his Corona diary on Instagram, and he would post himself doing his daily activities, at times being humorous, at times being very mundane. What's interesting is that with the pandemic, we have seen a kind of a push to more internet activity by not just the clerics, but many Iranians. And of course, that is something that we see around the globe as well, in particular the middle class who have somehow kind of access to internet. There are a number of Shia activities, many of them run by clerics, have gone online on Instagram. And these are live programs visiting shrines, and clerics are key participants to these different Instagram activities. There are also critical clerics who are critique of the state, and they have been actually basically been taken to the jury and to the courts for their political views on the Islamic Republic. Maybe we could talk about this in the Q&A session. Now, there are competitors to these Instagram clerics. Nohe Khan or Maddahi Khan is a person who does elegic performances on behalf of the imams during Ashura, during Muharram, Arba'in, and they are really way more popular than these clerics. And many of these Instagram clerics are critical of these actors because they find them to be really just commercial and profit-seeking people who really don't have a really high intention for religious matters. Conclusion. In fact, I should say there are multiple conclusions in this talk, which is just really a section of a paper I've written. The conclusions really would depend on multiple audiences. If you're interested in Islamism or Islamist, I would say that this paper wants to reject what Asad Bayat has portrayed in his famous book, Life as Politics, kind of juxtaposing Islamism as Puritanism in contrast to fun, leisure spaces that he fundamentally understands to be secular. This paper and presentation wants to problematize that binary. The second aspect has to do with the idea of the enactment of fun and social media. Since so much of social media is commodity culture, or cultures of commodity, can we understand clerical activism as a new kind of commodification of religion? That's a question that I still don't have an exact answer. I think the answer is way more complicated, but I'd like to entertain it at least as a conclusion. What we could say is that social media has become a kind of a cultural capital in the age of late capitalism. And this cultural capital should not be divorced from state power. How that cultural capital is being used and appropriated by a number of different kind of clerics, reformers, conservatives, and non-political clerics, it's something that is fascinating to study and consider taking a look at. Now, for those who are interested in digital religion, this is just the last slide. What we could say is that, yes, we could see the beginnings of a digital religion or digitized religion, which is really part and parcel to a so-called physical religion, if one could even call it that, or a material religion. But I don't distinguish these two, by the way, fundamentally. But what we do see is that we could speak of a kind of religiosity that increasingly becoming cyborg, that is increasingly having this aspect of the human, but the human that is constantly, increasingly becoming technological. In many ways, we could say that we are already all cyborgs. I mean, many of us are doing many of our activities online, and an extension of ourselves are out there in the digital sphere. Given the fact that I'm here in San Diego, extending myself, my thoughts, my ideas through this PowerPoint presentation to you in Doha or other places around the world is a cyborg experience. And one could say that this could be applied to different kinds of religious authority. Speaking of extending myself, I'd like to also ask everyone to consider following me on Instagram. I am very desperate to have 1,000 followers, so I've been waiting for that for a while. So in case you're interested, you could follow me. And I would really love to have your interaction on my Instagram. And I'm going to come to an end. Here we go. Let me stop sharing. Is this, have you stopped sharing or?
Yep.
Okay,
it's
perfect.
great. Yeah.
Perfect.
Professor Rahimi, thank you so very much. Only you and a scholar of your caliber could give us such an incredible panoramic view of the evolution of Shi'ism from its inception all the way to today, and capture the nuances and the complexities and the use of modern technology across time, from the telegraph in the tobacco concession in the 1800s all the way to today with Instagram and other kinds of digital media. So thank you so very much. It was just absolutely fascinating, and I'm definitely, I have my phone in hand, and as soon as I can, I'm going to follow you. And I think before our session is over, you're going to get the you're going to get the 1,000 followers. We have a couple of questions, but I will ask the first one if I may.
Absolutely.
And I know we have a number of questions, so in order to be able to get to as many of them as we can, probably not all of them, I ask that if possible, you keep the answers brief. So you alluded to this, but I'm interested in your thoughts on the jurisprudential orientations of many of these mid-ranking clerics who are active on digital media. Do they tend to fall on the conservative side insofar as ijtihad and fiqh are concerned, or do they fall on the is the gate of ijtihad open for them, or what in Iran is called dynamic ijtihad, fiqh puya, or is it or do they run the gamut one way or another?
Excellent question. And that was my question back in, let's just say, spring last year. And I have plans to go to Iran to do field work to really figure this thing out, because on Instagram, you really sometimes don't see the jurisprudence affiliation of many of these mid-ranking clerics. It's kind of hard to detect it. I mean, they're not going to come and say, I follow this particular marja. And of course, there are the political ones who clearly say, I follow Ayatollah Khamenei, who is a marja, and that definitely puts them somewhere between, well, mostly conservative, of course. But one needs to do kind of a field work to kind of figure that out. And that, of course, didn't happen. I wasn't able to visit. So my understanding and my hunch is this, if I could answer your question really briefly, is that most of the clerics who are very active on Instagram and social media, in particular Instagram, are reformist or non-political. Conservatives, which I should say that they also argue that their notion, or the fiqh to begin with, is always puya and dynamic, and the reformers are wrong for adding something to it. So that's their argument. But my understanding is that many of them, especially the higher mid-ranking clerics, and the higher you get, you don't get cleric involvement. But some of the conservative mid-ranking who are involved, they're very limited in comparison to the reformers and the non-political ones. So that would be my answer for now. But I may change my mind later on once I do my research more in depth.
Perfect. Thank you. A couple of questions have come to us through social media. There's a few on chat. I'll get to them. But one of the earliest questions that came is about the reaction that the social media and digital media activism have elicited from the clerical establishment, the rest of the clerical establishment, and the Iranian public? What has been the reaction particularly when these clerics are showing intimate moments of everyday lives for the public to see?
The red line has been if one of the clerics goes off and challenges, for instance, the Islamic Republic. Otherwise, what I've noticed is that much of the clerical activities, ATM, taking out money from ATM, showing your family with perhaps a flower on your wife's face, those are all accepted. In fact, my argument is that, in fact, it enhances their clerical prestige. And the reason why it does is precisely what the Usuli school of thought has advocated for centuries. The idea that fiqh is not an otherworldly activity, it's a this-worldly activity. You do jurisprudence in order to live a good life on earth, based on the principles, of course, the usul of religion. So it's very much, this Instagram phenomenon, it's very much within the paradigms of Usuli school of thought. And those who do oppose Instagram, they very much share an identity with previous clerics in previous decades and centuries. Remember, when radio was introduced, a number of clerics opposed it. And these clerics were conservative, not based on their worldview. They just simply didn't know how to deal with this new technology. And later on, they end up doing it themselves. They end up using radio or listening to radio themselves once they discover that actually it's not that such a bad thing. Same thing with microphones. Same thing with, Xerox machine and cassette tapes. So my hunch is that the Usuli school of thought has been very receptive to form different kinds of technology because, it very much wants to adapt itself to the modern or to the changing circumstances. And this is just one example.
Perfect, thank you. Is there a particular kind of piety or religiosity that's depicted through these posts?
Yeah, excellent question. These are wonderful questions. First and foremost is the piety of devotion to imams and the revered prophet, of course. That's first and foremost. And you find that mostly in the Facebook phase of clerical involvement. With the Instagram, things become more personalized. And how do you depict and perform piety is by showing your personal activities in depicting your pious, existence. Now, how do you do that? When you hold a child, when you go help a disabled person, when you go help an animal. That's how you do it. Mostly revolves around the idea of helping, hospitality, and more importantly, attending to the needy. So these are the things that also you find in the traditional text in which depicts clerics as those who are really there to support the public, especially the needy. I mean, that's what the clerics are supposed to be in the Usuli school of thought. They're supposed to be vali, or the guardians of the public common, the good. I mean, this is what Sistani is supposed to represent. And what these mid-ranking clerics do, they try to emulate that ethos through the Instagram. Mini valis. And then there's the great vali, Sistani or other majas out there.
Right. Thank you. We have a number of questions on the chat, so I'll just be very quick. I know we're short of time, but are these posts, one question asks, if it's they say reactionary, I suppose reaction to developments in life, or are they a result of conscious decisions that have been made?
Conscious decisions. I mean, these are, when I use the word innovative, in a sense that these are strategic activities. To begin with, when you or I go on Facebook or Instagram, we're being very strategic. The kind of picture we put on our profile is very strategic because we want to show a particular aspect of ourselves that would enable others to see us the way we want them to see us. I mean, think about that one particular Instagram account of the seminary students in Qom. The profile picture was a cleric playing soccer with a bunch of kids. I mean, there's just so many underlying semiotic dimensions, idea of not only play, but you're playing with children. This is a very common theme in the prophetic tradition. A prophet playing with children, showing the side that is kind, the side that is, very earthly. I mean, remember, prophet wasn't just a spiritual figure. He was also an earthly leader. He combined all those three traditions of authority. And they tried to do that in a very innovative way, negotiated and constructed way through Instagram by these profile pictures and all these different pictures out there. So it is a very conscious process. Is very, it's very creative at times. And I think it very much matches the Usuli tradition.
Right. Thank you. I know your research has been very specific on Iranian clergy, but there's a question about Sunni clergy, particularly in Saudi Arabia. Do you have any basis of comparison?
Not yet, but I do. I have followed a number of 2 or 3 Instagram accounts of Saudi-based clerics of the Sunni school of thought. And I'm very much in the beginning stages of trying to do a comparative. And this is really just for my own curiosity, because I think in order to study any of these cases, you need to become an expert in that particular field. It's almost like its own Truman Show world. All of these Instagram, they're all their own little worlds. So it would really take a lot of and consume a lot of time. But I definitely have that in mind. I have come across it, and not just with the Saudi-based Sunni clerics, but also different kinds of clerics around the Muslim world who are very actively participating. Some of them are Islamists, some of them are not. And we are looking at a massive phenomenon. And just to let you know, there is a field called digital religious studies that looks at clerical involvement in social media. They look at Zen Buddhist rabbis, you name it. And so there's something global happening here that we should not take our eyes off from.
Thank you. Did you follow any specific methodology in your research on the kind of virtual ethnography that you've been doing?
No, basically, my approach has been what is called sensual ethnography. I look at where certain affective themes pop up on Instagram, that they become red, so to speak, and I'll focus on those affective domains, and I'll try to study them. It's a very distinct form of ethnography, and doing it online makes it very difficult. I'm not in favor of just doing purely virtual ethnography, or it's called cyber ethnography. I very much believe in both, doing cyber and so-called offline ethnography. But for those that know my work a bit, I am not in favor of doing quote-unquote systematic methodology. I was trained in historical sociology, but I've done my best to do more phenomenological approaches. So that's my approach.
Thank you. Has there ever been, Professor Rahimi, controversy on the internet among Shia clerics that has had consequences outside of the blogosphere or outside of digital media sphere?
That's an excellent question. The only ones I have come across are political ones. As far as religious ones, the only one I noticed when I, was talking to a number of people years ago was a case of a cleric showing his family, but this was back in mid-2000s. That has completely changed. It's normal now to show your family on social media. So that was back in 2000s, mid-2000s. I remember there was a conversation about, how could this particular cleric show his family on Instagram? This is not good. This is not permitted. And that was really the main thing I remember that I came across. Otherwise, most of the controversies revolve around politics, Iranian politics. Now, one could go beyond and look at Shia clerics based in Iraq, Lebanon, Bahrain, and other places, and things get way more complicated. They're all about local politics. There's little about religious controversy because most clerics are very clever in the way they come to cyberspace. But the thing that creates always the controversy is politics.
Right, thank you. Has there the digital media activism has it had an impact on gender discourse in contemporary Shiism?
Yes, I think I already talked about that one particular article that was published. It has allowed certain gender identities to be reformulated in social media in ways that we never imagined back in, say, late 1990s. The most important is the aspect of unveiling, but I have also argued that there's an aspect of veiling as well, that there are a number of, conservative, quote unquote, female students who have found cyberspace as a protected place to come and discuss things and discuss their personal life. In fact, I don't call it unveiling, I call it veiling. It's a very interesting way of covering a particular aspect of your personhood through social space and cyberspace. And that is very interesting phenomena. And nowadays you see that a lot in Twitter. Now I didn't talk about Twitter. Twitter is a bit different. Twitter became popular in Iran sometime in 2016, 2017. And Twitter is huge among Iranian female religious actors. It's huge. I mean, this is where they come and they discuss their marriage proposals. The guy who has come to do khasagari or do a marriage proposal, should I accept them? And then there are all these comments in the Twitter, feed. And it's like, yes, how does he look like? Does he have taqwa? Does he have piety? Does he have... That's where you find that in the Twitter sphere. In the Instagram sphere is mostly male clerics. Now, there are female religiously minded actors as well, don't get me wrong, but it is really in Twitter that we are seeing some fascinating stuff happening in terms of gender identity and the way in which gender is being represented and performed in that particular microblog sphere.
This is fascinating, Professor Rahimi. There's a related question, in fact, a segue to the next question. You did mention some red lines that may not necessarily, that people abstain from, but there are also questions, as you alluded to, that are submitted, for example, to Ayatollah Sistani about very intimate relations between couples. Are there other topics that can be touched upon or are red lines? For example, same-sex marriage or women, gender roles, other related topics?
Excellent question. That is coming from mostly apparently diaspora. Questions about, same-sex marriage, homosexuality, gay rights, transgender. And that's coming. Now, transgender is a bit different because of, this element of Ayatollah Khomeini permitting gender, I forget the technical term for the surgery that is done.
Gender reassignment.
That's right, gender reassignment. That issue has been resolved. And this is also a very typical Usuli paradigm of solving these issues that, some could easily ask their marja and there could be an answer. And in that case, Ayatollah Khomeini had an answer. In terms of sexuality, actually, my understanding is that Shi'i Usuli school has been very free and open. I mean, we saw just one example with Sistani. Again, I come back to this. The thing that has really created a lot of ihtiyat in the way marjas give answers to their followers has been political one. I noticed that in the case of Sistani in 2003 to 2006, when many people were asking, should we, for instance, support this particular prime minister? Should we support this? Sistani was very careful not to have specific answers. He would always have generic ones. Through his representatives, he managed to create this balance of being above politics while at the same time being very active in a very innovative way. And I think that's where we got into kind of muddy and troubled waters. But otherwise, when it talks about sex, oral sex, you name it, things related to economy, am I able to steal books from Jews? I remember once coming across that question. Of course not. You shouldn't do that. You shouldn't do that. Can I, hit, my wife? No, you shouldn't. and of course that depends on the match. So there are these very intimate questions that people ask, sometimes very borderline transgressive or sometimes very transgressive, but they're all, if you notice, they're either about the domestic sphere or they're about things that are meant to be about Shias protecting themselves against, for instance, Israelis or Jews or whatever. And then the answer is usually, hey, just be cautious, be cautious, don't do something that could harm you and others. And that's something I felt that was very interesting coming from the Marja.
Professor, we could be here another 4 or 5 hours and listen to you. Endlessly fascinating. And I know that I speak on behalf of others in expressing deep gratitude. One last question before we let you go. Could you please repeat for us your Instagram name?
Oh, gosh. You're too kind, Professor. This is absolutely making my day. Well, a rainy day, I should say. My Instagram account is Babak Rahimi, San Diego. And I purposely put that so I wouldn't be confused with that other model. So hopefully you'll be looking at this model, Babak Rahimi. Babak Rahimi, San Diego. So
we'll look for the more handsome one in San Diego. More handsome Babak Rahimi.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you.
You have my eternal gratitude, and I am also grateful to my colleagues at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, and also to our audiences here in Doha and worldwide. Thank you very much for joining us. And Professor, thank you again.
Thank you, Professor Kamrava. Thank you for inviting me. Thanks everyone for listening to my more than an hour of discussion and talk. I'm most grateful for your time.
It was fascinating. Thank you so very much. And
thank you.
Good day to everyone.
Good day. Good day, everyone. Good day.
Good day.